Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. I just realized that this is like the perfect follow-on to the rocket scientist, because now we're like sciencing the crap out of this. So this is going to be great. Who here likes math? Oh, this is like the strongest ever. Who here doesn't like math? Either way, this is all going to work. It's all going to work. Is anyone here familiar with the state of DevOps reports? Okay. A few hands. So that's what this is based on. If you're not, still totally fine. I've been studying the types of things that are important and predictive and contribute to better software development delivery since about late '07. That's what my piece of my dissertation was on. And then specifically, what I'm going to be talking about here are some of the data from the state of DevOps reports. But I'll kind of tie in some of the things that I've found since then. So. What we'll be going over, how to make your data suck less. We'll start with some of the survey stuff. So the state of DevOps reports focus on, or they use a survey methodology because I need to collect data from around the world in about a 4 to 6 week time period from thousands of people. So right now I've got a data set that's over 25,000. It represents over 25,000 teams. I've been working on another project right now just to kind of compare, where I'm trying to collect real system data. It takes me 4 to 6 weeks just to get a hold of the security people to make sure I can get that data released. So this is why I'm using some of those survey questions. So how I make sure the survey questions are good. And by the way, these methods apply also to system and log data. So my background was actually as a hardware performance engineer. I did that at IBM for a long time. And I would use very similar methods and methodologies to clean up some of my log data. So this can apply as well. And then we'll go through what we found that we did and we didn't expect. When I say we, my main collaborators on this are Jez Humble, who wrote Continuous Delivery, and Gene Kim, who wrote the Phoenix Project. So then I'll talk about some continuous delivery things, some management things, sprinkle in some culture. As is typical with probably anybody who's given a talk, I just went through my slides really quick, added a few things at least a good 10 minutes ago, so this is a solid slide deck. And I've got way too much content, so I'm gonna try to go through as much as we can, because this is all really good stuff. So I'll go ahead and turn around for this so you don't worry about hurting my feelings. Who here thinks surveys are shit? Some hands, okay, some hands, that's fine. Who here loves data from their log files? Okay, a lot of hands. Who here has seen crap data in your log files? Seriously, every single hand, right? So, this is my full of loving kindness response when people are like, Nicole, love you. You collect surveys, people lie. Your log files lie too, right? So either way, it's so are we gonna throw everything out and believe nothing? Or can we go through a few steps to find ways to have a reasonable expectation that we can trust something? So these are some of the things that we can do, or that we do with survey data, and we can do similar things with log data. So with survey data, we use what's called a latent construct. And here's what this is. So if I want to capture the temperature of a room, I can get a number, right? I can ask someone what a temperature is, I can get a number. If I want to ask you what your happiness is a little tricky. What if I want to ask about culture, right? So we just heard about the importance of culture at JPL. Culture's really hard. How do I find out your temperature of your culture? How do I get one number? So what we do for a latent construct is we ask about, imagine this ridiculous Venn diagram with 4 or 5 things that are all really closely overlapped. That's how we do a latent construct. We measure several different facets, several aspects of an idea. We measure those in ways. We test all of these ways, to make sure that they're valid and reliable, and we'll talk about that. And then we can combine those into a single measure to come up with one number for your, say, cultural temperature. That's a good way to measure that. So when we think about log files and system data, sometimes we have who also has way too many measurements and way too many numbers, right? We probably have telemetry on everything, or maybe we have telemetry on nothing, right? Sometimes we're at 2 ends of the scale. Sometimes we want to reduce that complexity by looking at measurements that they might be measuring facets of one general idea. So that's another example of, a good example of a latent construct. So how we do this in surveys is we use psychometrics to make our survey data good. And by good, I mean, give me a reasonable assurance that what it's measuring is actually what it's measuring. What it's telling me is what I think it's telling me. So it includes 2 basic steps. The first one's the manual step. So like whenever possible, I use measures that have already gone through this whole process. If not, then I start with a good definition and theory. I word it really carefully and precisely. I use a card sorting task, which means I take a whole bunch of them, write them on 3x5 cards, and hand them to a bunch of people. And I say, put these in piles according to what you think makes sense. And then I pilot test it. We can do this with log systems also. When we think we want to measure something, let's write down exactly what it is we think we want to measure. Give it a word, give it a definition, because words have power and definitions matter. And then everyone knows what it is we're talking about. Carefully and precisely word it, and then come up with a card sorting task. If we have a whole bunch of different metrics in our log and system file data, we can put them down on a bunch of 3x5 cards and ask people to sort them according to things that we think might be similar ideas and concepts. So we do this with survey questions. Okay, then we get into the stats part. When I get into the stats part, I can do something similar to the card sorting task, but based on numbers. So once I get a whole bunch of responses, I can establish validity. So one is discriminant validity. I make sure that when people answer those survey questions, they're not answering for anything that I don't want them to be answering for. And convergent validity, they're answering for the same idea that I think they're answering for. Also reliability. It's making sure that everyone who's reading this survey question is reading it similarly, reading it the same way. This also goes back to why I ask several questions. So, well, first of all, when you're writing this, you want to make sure that you're not trying to game the system intentionally. So really bad I'm sure we've all seen really bad marketing survey questions, or the really bad political ones. 'Tis the season, right? So as long as we're writing them carefully, we should be avoiding this. But I'll always start with I try to start with at least 4, sometimes 5, because what happens if I write one, I write 4 or 5, right? And I think they're all perfect, right? Sorry. I love them. I think they're awesome. I run them past my co-authors, my conspirators. We think they're awesome. I run it past a group of 10, 15 people. They think they're awesome. But we all kind of work together. Then I roll it out past a few thousand people. If I only have one question, and that one question is misinterpreted or misread or understood differently, I don't know. I just don't know. But if I have 4 questions, and this question is understood totally differently from these 3, that will show up in the numbers, and I can throw this question out, and I still have 3 that hold really, really well together. Here's the other thing that I'll mention. People are always like, people lie. People lie all the time. Your survey's shit. People lie. It's really difficult for every single person in an organization-wide or industry-wide, right, to systematically lie to the exact same degree, in the exact same direction on all of these questions and have it not show up in the data, right? Outliers I can throw out. It'll show up in the data. So this is also a really good way to help catch that. So we can think about this in our log data as well. If I only have, some measurement's better than no measurement, but if I only have one measurement, what's the risk if that one number's off or if it's instrumented incorrectly? So this is how we run through this. Okay, here's an example. So culture is a great idea. So we wanted to capture culture. We started with, does it even matter? More than intuition, because people are like, oh yeah, culture's super important. Okay, why, right? Do we actually think it matters? And what kind of culture? Are we talking about national identity and norms? People who live different places have different cultures. Is that the type of culture that we're talking about? Probably not, right? If you go to enough tech conferences, we're probably not talking about that type of culture, although that's still a valid question. That shows up in financial literature all the time, actually. Adaptive culture, a culture that values learning. We did that in the 2014 study. We decided to capture and really focus on a culture that values information flow and trust. So then we went back to the literature and we found this really interesting study by a PhD, named Ron Westrum. He's a sociologist. He studies healthcare, aviation, environments that are high risk. High risk, highly complex, highly adaptive systems. Things go wrong, and when things go wrong, really bad things can happen. Does this sound familiar? Right? So he hadn't studied it in tech, but I was like, totally works for tech. Actually, a piece of my dissertation argued that these types of contexts, the things that we find there, probably apply really well. The other thing that was really interesting here is that he argued that this framework would help predict what happens when things go wrong. I was like, super yes, this is gonna be great. So this is the typology that appeared in his 2004 paper. This isn't survey questions, but it gave us a really good basis for how to write survey questions. But this is still gonna be kind of hard. So take a minute and think about how you might word a survey question. Now, the key here is to use strong statements with clear language. So I keep saying survey questions because people are used to hearing that, but we don't actually write them as a question. Use a strong statement with clear language that people can answer on a scale from usually 1 to 7, strongly disagree 1, strongly agree 7. So how we did this is we selected one side, so we selected generative, and we turned them into statements, focusing on the team, right? Because individuals don't deliver software, teams do. This is how we did this. On my team, information is actively sought. On my team, failures are learning opportunities, and messengers of them are not punished. On my team, well, and it said on my team, and then like ... Responsibilities are shared. Cross-functional collaboration is encouraged and rewarded. Failure causes inquiry. New ideas are welcomed. So we went through, and we found that these are statistically valid and reliable, 3 years in a row now, 2014, the 2015 study, and the 2016 study. We also found that this is predictive of IT performance and organizational performance. My happy nerd moment came when Dr. Westrum emailed me a few months ago and said, hey, I heard you've been using my work. Can I see your stuff? And I sent it to him, and I was like, please, did I do it right? And he emailed me back about a month later and said, this has been applied quite well. Thank you. This is very good. Yay! It made it through peer review, so there's a part of me that's like, yeah, like it passed the sanity check, but then there's this other thing where it's like, okay, but like, did it pass the in his head check? Oh, and by the way, there are a handful of teams across industry now that check in on their teams every 4 to 6 months to see how the team's doing. Because we do know that when teams start fighting, technology starts breaking. So here's another example. Notification of failure. So, audience participation time. We went through the rounds that we talked about, right? We had a good idea that notification of failure would be a good predictor of IT performance, or at least would be highly correlated with IT performance. We wrote these up, we worded them very carefully, we did pilot testing, we did the card sorting task. This was original in 2014, but there was a surprise. So we do a card sorting task manually, and then we do like a statistical card sorting task. These didn't load, that's the word. They didn't load into one group. Can anyone spot? Can anyone guess what happened here? Do you want us to just see the answer? Yeah.
It's different people noticing the problem.
It's different people noticing the problem. Here's where they split. But it doesn't tell me why, so we had to kind of hypothesize, so then we named them slightly differently. And it turns out, so there's near and there's far, right? The types of places where that notification was coming from. Okay, now can you guess, when we take a look at the correlations, which one is more highly correlated with performance? Near. Notifications from near, right? Absolutely. So that was one surprise. Okay, and then, by the way, I do a whole bunch of other data tests. So I make sure there's no common method variance. There is a risk when you collect all of your data from a survey that I'm introducing bias just from the fact that all of my data comes from one source. When I do studies that integrate surveys and system log data, I have less concern with that, but there's a whole bunch of tests from here, Lindell and Whitney, Podzikoff, there's a bunch of tests I can do for that, which I do. I also check early and late responders to make sure they're not significantly different across major variables, like just in case like something went funny when I was collecting data. I also look at survey drop-off rates to see if there's any bias introduced there. All of the data was fine. Okay, Now, so I've done all of this work. It's not until this point where I can actually start seeing how the variables relate to each other. This is where I finally start looking at that. Here's where I'm going to make a quick side note. For me to take a look at prediction in any of this, one of three conditions must be met. Otherwise, I will always stop at correlation. So it has to be a longitudinal data set. So the state of DevOps data is not longitudinal. And some people are like, what do you mean? You do it several years. I do it several years, but it's not matched. So when we send out those invitations, they don't have cookies. So I don't have a matched data piece. So it's not longitudinal. 2, it has to be a randomized experimental design. This is non-experimental, right? It's just, I don't experimentally send out certain surveys to certain people. Everyone gets the same thing. Or 3, theory-based design. I have to have some reasonable expectation for why one thing should predict another. Otherwise, it could just be some crazy fluke in the data, right? Have you guys heard of the website Spurious Correlations? It's so great. Did you know that pool deaths, it's sad, pool deaths go up, it's highly correlated with the same years of Nicolas Cage movies being released? That's not predictive. It's not causal. It just happens because who knows, right? That's why we have to make sure we have a reason for believing this might exist. Otherwise, it's just a fluke in the data. And that's why if this last condition isn't met, then we only report correlations. So I have to meet 2 conditions. The math has to work out, and I have to have some reason pre-existing in theory. Okay, here we go. Key finding. This was super exciting. About IT performance. IT performance, we define this as a combination of throughput and stability. So our throughput measures our lead time for changes in release frequency, and our stability measures are MTTR and change fail rate. We find that these move together, and this is true 3 years in a row. So the high performers, and when I talk about high performers, medium performers, and low performers, I let this be a data-driven analysis here. I throw these 4 things into the big pot, and I say, dear analysis, tell me how they fall out into groups. And I find a whole group of teams hanging out up here that are statistically similar to each other and different from everyone else, where all 4 of these things are very good. I find a group hanging out in the middle, where everything is in the middle, and they're similar to each other and dissimilar from everyone else. And then I find a group at the bottom, where everything kind of sucks. But they're similar to each other and different from everyone else. And because I'm super creative, I call them high performers, medium performers, low performers. But the thing that's interesting is that they all move together. The high performers are doing everything well. The low performers pretty much suck at everything. The medium performers are kind of middle of the road all over the place, which right now everyone's like, yeah, okay. I'm not seeing trade-offs. For years, ITIL has suggested or implied or hinted that we need to be throttling speed and throughput in order to get stability, right? I don't see it anywhere, right? We have suggestions that we should have 2-week handoffs or delays, or I don't see it. So this was awesome. It shows up in the data over and over and over again. Another one that was really great, IT performance matters. Firms with high-performing IT organizations were twice as likely to exceed their profitability, market share, and productivity goals. We also found in this HIT peer review, IT performance is predictive of organizational performance. Org performance is that profitability, product share, our market share, and productivity. So this is great, right? And this is fantastic because for years, who here's heard IT is a cost center? Who here has heard that way too many times, right? We hear that all the time. And that came out of, or it really started influencing executives. There was a 2003 paper that hit Harvard Business Review that was titled, IT doesn't matter. That sucks, right? IT absolutely matters, right? And IT performance matters. But what kind of IT, right? How do you do IT right? And so that's also what we looked into. So we know that continuous delivery is important, right? So in 2015, we took a look at what makes CD right. And so CD done right. When you take a look at the left-hand side of this diagram, these things make up continuous delivery. So test deployment, or test automation, deployment automation, trunk-based development, continuous integration, that really was just kind of a CI construct that year, and also all the things in version control, okay? So those were the things that we tested. These things, once you move beyond that, we can say predict. Okay, so they predict lower levels of deployment pain, which I think is awesome, right? Because we don't want, I don't want that panic Fridays at 5. It also predicts higher levels of IT performance, predicts lower change fail rates, and IT performance then goes through to predict org performance. Here's with the math. So this is out of a peer review paper. The other thing that was nice here is that we found that it also decreased burnout, which was great as well. The thing about research is that you do it kind of incrementally, right? You can't do way too much at a time, or it's it just doesn't happen. So in 2016, we added a bit more to our investigation of continuous delivery. So the things in bold are the things that are new. So we added effective test data management to see if that was important and predictive, and indeed it is. Trunk-based development was listed before, but this time we explicitly tested trunk-based development and monorepo, and that ends up being very important. And then shifting left on security ends up being really important as well. And if you do it the right way, it doesn't slow things down. There was a big concern. Everyone's like, oh, shift left on security, shift left on security. And everyone's like, if I do that, it will slow the process down. It doesn't have to slow the process down if you include security in design, if you have them help with pre-approved libraries and testing, and we have guidance in the report around that. Continuous delivery is then predictive of the things we found before, right? Lower levels of deployment pain, higher IT perf, lower change fail rates. What it also did is it helps decrease the amount of unplanned rework, which is also awesome. I don't know about you, but I hated it when I was always having to redo and refactor all my work all the time. It also helps contribute to identifying strongly with the organization you work for, which is we'll touch on that in a minute, but it's pretty similar to basically loving your job and wanting to stay there, which makes sense. If I'm doing awesome things, who wants to stay at a job where you're doing awesome, super cool tech things? Yeah, and then, by the way, that also predicts org performance, because then we stay there, we do better work, it creates this virtuous cycle. We also tell our jobs, come work with my company. It makes sense and it's awesome, but we can now show, dear company, investing in these awesome tech things makes our work better, makes our lives better. It pays off in the long run. Okay, some surprises. So let's dig into some of the tech here. Okay, what do we think is not strongly correlated with IT perf? Okay, here we go. Third-party scripts, homegrown scripts, golden images, manual config management, not strongly correlated. Commercial config management tools, not correlated at all. Open source, highly correlated. Okay, which of these measure effective test practices? Now, this is an example of the statistical card sorting task. So which things do you think didn't load? They just completely fell out. Remember how I said I ask a whole bunch of questions and see which ones I have to toss? Which ones needed to be tossed? It's the one where other people are doing our tests. Okay, change management. Similar, okay? So this is that same card sorting task. Now I'll note that first one has an R next to it. That means it's reverse coded. So I asked people the question and then I reversed it, right? Because I needed to find another way to ask extra questions. So you can read it. No production changes are reviewed by an external body. So here, the one that got tossed, or that just didn't load, it wasn't the same thing, is this one. And it could be that I was asking too many weird things, right? Suddenly I start introducing a database. I'm not talking about things like a database anywhere else. I start talking about risk, a risk profile, which was too different. But the rest of them loaded really well together. Okay, I'm gonna sneak in culture super quick. We wanted to take a look at additional measures of culture. So are you familiar with, is anyone here familiar with the Google study? Google has studied managers for years, and they were like, yay, managers. Oh wait, of our 37,000 people, only 1,000 of them are managers. Let's study the people, figure out what makes the perfect team. They thought what would make the perfect team is like the mix of like a Node.js programmer and a product manager and an R programmer, and no. What they found out is it all comes down to team dynamics. Number one thing is psychological safety, and then dependability, structure and clarity, meaning and impact. So we turned these into questions, or items, right? And then we also added identity. So identity is adapted from Concanaly et al. It's an MIS paper. And then we also had the Westrum items. If you remember the Westrum items, they talked about failure leads to inquiry, novelties implemented, those types of things. I couldn't fit all of it on a slide. Here's what we found. The Google items split in half. When I tried to like load them in like the statistical card sorting task, the bottom half loads with the identity items, structure and clarity, meaning and impact of your work, and the top two items, psychological safety and dependability, loaded with Westrum. And so you actually don't see the Google items show up in the report because we just tossed them. We kept Westrum and we kept identity. Okay, management stuff. So we know that managing WIP's important, but in the 2015 study, there was like not a strong correlation between WIP and IT perf, which was super surprising. Super surprising. So like, what's going on? Could there be some better way to explain what's happening? Turns out there is. The good way to explain this is that WIP is an important part of an overall lean management strategy. Then we get better prediction. Then this makes more sense, where lean management is part of effective WIP limits. We use visual displays to monitor quality, and we use monitoring tools to make business decisions. And then these together predict a stronger culture, higher levels of IT performance. It also decreases burnout. And then these together predict org performance. In 2016, we went farther up into kind of the fuzzy front end, and we took a look at the importance of, and we found that it indeed was important to gather, broadcast, and implement customer feedback so that everyone knows why it is we're doing what we're doing. Just because like someone in a suit told me to, or because like it's important to the business. And also being able to decompose work into small pieces so we can actually get that single piece flow. That was really important, and making that process visible. And then this lean product management, we call it lean product management because these things all kind of together predict, again, identifying strongly with the org you work for. Because again, now that I know why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, I'm more bought in. I want to do the work. I want to be with this organization. It predicts a stronger culture, predicts higher levels of IT perf, and it again reduces the deployment pain. Okay, so some conclusions. Even if you think it's obvious, test with data. If the results don't surprise you, you're doing it wrong. But if every single result surprises you, you're probably also doing it wrong. There should be a healthy mix here. There should be some things that you're like, okay, yes, this makes me feel good. This is what I was expecting. But, oh, oops, surprise, right? There should be kind of some mix in there. Also, we can have it all, or at least throughput and stability. We really can if we're doing all these things right. Also, IT matters. IT matters as long as we do include a technology piece, a process practice piece, and a culture piece. The reason IT wasn't mattering before is because someone just tried to like buy technology and plug it in and then walk away. Or they would try to like redo all the process and like leave everything else alone. Or they were gonna redo the culture and then leave everything else alone. We need to have all the pieces, and then magic is possible. And DevOps culture and practices really do have a measurable impact on IT and org performance. Finally, if you want to see more sciencing, we're working on an ROI white paper in final steps right now, and you can get links to those peer-reviewed research that were in like little fine print at the bottom. And thanks. Let me know if you have any questions. Yes.
logs? And if so, what kind of logs were they?
So the question was, did I take data from logs, and if so, what kind of logs were they? I didn't take data from logs for this study, but I have in the past. And those types of logs can have ranged and have varied. So I've taken logs out of knowledge bases, knowledge management systems, so we can see what types of questions and what types of help people are getting, and to also take a look at their social network. I've done that as kind of a proxy for, not culture, but reach and communication. I've done system logs and performance. I've done network logs and performance, and I've done like data monitoring tools.
Okay.
The interesting thing, the interesting thing about many of these, let me scroll up just a little bit and find the one I want. The nice thing about a lot of this is you can go through and you can say, okay, now I can see that putting application code is really important for continuous delivery. What are some of the things that I could do in my own log systems to capture and proxy? So proxy, like how can I find measures to capture that in my own system, in my own environment? Does anyone here? I mean, GitHub, Bitbucket, right? We can find ways to proxy some of those measures. Trunk-based development and continuous integration. Trunk-based development, are we checking code into trunk? How many branches do we have open? How often does my team check into trunk? Right, so we do have ways, and I've worked with teams to talk about this, to say what types of things can we measure to proxy for a lot of these things. I just didn't for this study because it's too hard to collect all that data from thousands of, this one was 4,607 respondents. Yes, question?
I happen to be lucky enough to work for a company that's kind of bought in on a lot of these concepts. And part of what you said there, trust, check, and then if everything lines up and it all agrees, you're doing it wrong. And if it all doesn't agree, you're doing it wrong. Like I said, we have the benefit that we're actually doing these things, but when it comes to actually measuring them, I don't know really how much they do that. So are there any third parties or any processes that you know of, thinking through the concepts, talking what you're talking about, how many branches are open? Okay, some of those suggestions, is there a third party that you know of, or some white paper or something that you can say, all right, start measuring on these things, here are some ways to do this, and this is how to kind of, use the statistical model that you're talking about, when there's nobody really at our organization that really is a statistical, someone has the ability to analyze it the way you're talking about, into these groups, into these things. So third-party white paper, something like that, we can go to say, all right, let's test what we are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So last year so a few answers. There was a white paper that came out of DevOps Enterprise Forum, or DevOps Enterprise Summit, 2015. There was a white paper on measuring effectiveness and efficiency. And it was pretty high level. It includes the culture questions. I co-authored it, but there were, I think, probably 12 of us. Eric Passmore at Microsoft, Simon Guggenheimer at Microsoft, Walker Royce. I know I'm going to leave out a whole bunch of people, but there were probably a dozen of us who've done measurement in several different areas, and it offers suggestions for some of this. The trick is you kind of need to think first about what you want to measure and which things are important. So like, you don't have to start with this, but this might be one area, and then you can say what are measures that we could have. Third-party tools, Chef does have a DevOps journey assessment called Dojo that they offer. DevOps Research has an assessment they offer as well called the X-ray assessment. There's a startup that's starting to work right now on collecting some of the back-end metrics, but they're still in early stages, called Journey. Consulting firms will always do kind of one-offs. I'd be happy to chat with you and like sketch out some basics. Yeah. Did I see another hand? Yes.
Could you touch on the monorepo findings or information that you had?
Sure. So the monorepo findings are that it's important and predictive, and that some of the key things there are that you should be checking into trunk. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. Less than 3 branches, you should be committing. It was less than 3 branches. You should be checking in daily, and all teams. There was one more. I'm trying to remember. It was really interesting though because I was working with another team on the DORA scorecard I was mentioning, and they ran through and they did an assessment, and the assessment includes assessment and benchmarking and then a prioritization, and trunk-based development came up as one of their high priorities, that and visualization, and they dug into it, and someone on the team was like trunk-based, it's totally not us, right? Like that only works for small startups, and we're like, no, like Google uses a mono repo. Google has 2 branches, and their branch is for Chrome. Like, that's a hell of a branch, right? Like, let's be real, that's an entire product. And I think, like, their car or something, right? So, Google's basically a mono repo. And we were like, no, that like, you really should consider digging into that. And so, this company, which is a very large financial services firm, dug in, and they just got back to me a couple weeks ago, and they said, you know what, you were totally right. We dug into it, and we realized that the teams that were basically developing mono repo, they were killing it on everything. And the teams that were not, they weren't doing it because they were protecting themselves from other architectural things, or they were not doing it because of other reasons. And as soon as we got that cleared, like they drastically, exponentially improved their delivery, speed, and stability along all factors. And there was one team that was even like just trying to force it, and they were completely burning themselves out, and that showed up in the scale as well. You know, of course, we had people that were like, seriously, we're over measuring, you're gonna do another survey? My team's fine. And that team was like, they were doing okay, and their burnout scale was just off the charts. And so they were not gonna make it very long.
In terms of like those studies, what was the range in number of teams that participated in the mono repo?
So I'm trying to remember like how much I could, well, that participate in the one that I just talked about or in this?
Any of them, just in terms of like
So that last one, I'm not sure I can say. I know that we studied, well, so they didn't tell me how many were and weren't, because they ended up digging into the whole organization. They only they tested, I think we did 6 lines of business in the whole, but it's a very large financial services firm. And then they basically said, okay, like you've convinced us, and so they just took a look, they did a quick look at everyone in the whole organization to do a quick check into their mono repo practices, and people who had it down, they just said keep doing it, keep refining it, keep moving towards, and people who were not even close and saying no, we aren't going to do mono repo, they're like, why? Let's understand why. So, okay, I think, are we at time? Okay, we're at time. If anyone would like to find me later, I would be happy to find questions. I will be around all conference. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.